Online gaming gets taken to court. The Brits are trying to get into the console business. And Nolan Bushnell screams his lungs out. All of this and more on the premiere episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
What is up? It's me, Mario. Please save me.
Welcome to the premiere episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl Kuras. Now, the purpose of this new podcast is to look back in time, not necessarily at which games came out when or which previews were big in magazines and other news outlets. No, the main purpose of this podcast is going to be to look back at news headlines. So company moves, industry changes, threats from politicians, what was going on maybe behind the scenes. Now, the reason why I'm taking this tack or this approach with this podcast is that I've always been fascinated as a gamer with the industry itself. I've always found it almost more interesting than playing the games to find out who was doing what. Why did Sega sometimes license their home computer ports of their games through one company or another? Why did one developer suddenly show up in a game, making a game for a completely different system or for a different publisher? I always felt it was almost like some big, massive soap opera going on behind the scenes. And that story, the story of the soap opera in the video game industry, is usually not something that is told month to month through reviews and previews, but through the little news snippets that we would find in magazines. So the format of this podcast is that every month I'm going to be looking back 20, 30, and 40 years. So in this, the November 2018 episode, we're going to be looking back at news and highlights from November of 1978, November of 1988, and November of 1998. And I'll be looking at news stories from magazines dated November 1998, and I already know the historians out there, I agree with you, this is not optimal because magazines usually have to be finished and edited at least a month or two before they hit the newsstand, so probably the things that were dated November 1998 were actually showing up or being written in September, maybe even June or July of 1998. But for our purposes, it makes everything a little bit more easy to organize just because it's not always going to be possible to get original press releases and so forth, especially not with the resources I have. I'm not an industry insider. I don't have any massive databases to act on, so I really have to go by some kind of unifying standard to decide when to report on which issues. For the 40-year jump into the 70s at this point, that's obviously a little bit trickier because there were very few dedicated publications. There were none for the video game industry itself. There were a few publications for consumer electronics, some publications for the arcade industry, but nothing really dedicated to video games. So I'm going to be looking through newspapers, New York Times and the like, as well as histories of the industry and trying to piece together a little bit of what was happening at the time in an industry that was really in its birthing stages and really didn't have the kind of publications that would give us a historical record. So with that being said, the other question that some people might be asking is, why am I not looking back at 10 years ago? And the reason for that is, after doing some research and thinking about it for a while, I came to the conclusion that 10 years just isn't far enough back to have enough historical perspective. Especially nowadays in 2018, we just had the release of Red Dead Redemption 2, which was a game that had an 8-year cycle to develop it. to say nothing of the fact that console cycles seem to be getting a little bit longer, and the impact of some of those developments may or may not really be visible or judgeable at this point. With that being said, I'm going to limit myself to 20, 30, and 40-year jumps. I'm going to try to keep each episode at about an hour 20 max. I can't promise I'll always be able to do that. And I'm always going to try to give as much context as possible to the things I'm talking about. So, with that out of the way, I am going to now turn on the time machine and let's jump back 40 years to November of 1978. Our first source for news from 1978 is Atari's in-house news flyer, the Coin Connector. Now, this was a bi-monthly publication that was targeted at arcade owners. And in the November-December issue, they're talking about their appearances at the trade shows over the summer. Again, that whole time lag for publication thing. And their big highlights were the games Space Rider, Super Breakout, and Atari's Football. Now, Space Rider, the headliner, if you're scratching your head going, I don't remember an Atari video game called Space Rider, well, it wasn't a video game. It was a pinball machine. Now, Atari at this point, even though they had started out making video games, had to jump into the pinball industry as well, just because pinball was still the 900-pound gorilla in the arcades. If you weren't in pinball, you weren't in the arcades. And so they highlight as the top biller their Space Rider pinball game, and they also mention that they have another pinball machine, Middle Earth, coming out, which may or may not just be a coincidence that it's also being highlighted at the same time that Ralph Bakshi's animated Lord of the Rings is hitting theaters. Now, the video games of this era that Atari is promoting that are probably historically a little bit more significant are Atari Football and Super Breakout. Now, Super Breakout, of course, is a enhanced version of the original Breakout, but Atari's Football really writes some first, and the big one there is that it is the first video game, by many accounts, to include scrolling. So you now have your football players on a field, but you don't see the entire field at once. The fact that the field could move dramatically increased the realism of the game. It also featured an ability to choose between 4 offensive and 4 defensive plays for the players, which actually added a lot to the realism and also to the complexity of the game. And it would become a standard practice for football games going forward. Oh, and here we're talking about American football for our international listeners. So, in 1978, Atari still has to put out pinball machines, and it's really a sign that even though Space Invaders, the game that would change that balance of power forever, had been released earlier in the year, it was still taking a while to really ripple through the industry. Our next story was not reported in any magazines or newspapers of the time, but it definitely bears mentioning. And that is that over Thanksgiving of 1978, Jim Connolly and John Freeman, 2 friends out in California, they played D&D together, and they'd even written some amateur programs for the Commodore PET to help them run their D&D games, decide to form a gaming company called Automated Simulations. Now, Automated Simulations would start out making computer role-playing games, most notably the Dungeon Quest series that included the Apshai games. But later on, they would change their name to Epix, and Epix would, of course, be one of the main computer game companies of the 1980s, giving us such classics as Summer Games and Winter Games, California Games, World Games, as well as non-games games, such as Pit Stop 2, and one of my own personal favorites, G.I. Joe on the Commodore 64, which introduced me, at least, to the idea of deathmatch with 2-player mode, a bunch of different characters with different stats you could choose from, and a variety of environments with different types of obstacles and hazards. If you haven't already played it at some point, I definitely recommend grabbing 2 joysticks, inviting a friend over, and seeing if Snake Eyes can really take out Destro. Okay, now on to our next story, and this one comes from the New York Times. Now, it doesn't get any more mainstream than this, and the New York Times has an article about the big electronic games coming out for the Christmas season, and it's a bit of a buyer's guide or information for the consumer on what to look for and what are the hot items. Now, this also shows a little bit of what the perceptions were at the time from a layman's standpoint, as opposed to what a historian may see as being what was the hot item or the cool thing to have at the time. Now, they do talk in this article quite extensively about how the Pong consoles of the last few years are starting to fade out, and that this whole new fad of the cartridge-based console, even though they don't really call it that, is starting to take hold. But the big thing that seems to have caught their attention and would also become the big item for 78 was the electronic video game toy. And these were the handheld LED-based games from companies like Mattel, Coleco, Entex, and Pulsonic that would really take the market by storm over the Christmas period. Now, most of these were things like electronic football, baseball, and so forth, hockey. These were sports simulations, very much in line with toy industry standards, things that companies like Mattel and Coleco would know how to do and be able to manufacture and sell in mass quantities at prices people could afford. Now, companies like Entex and Pulsonic, who get into this business for a short while, are mainly semiconductor and electronics companies. And while they do have some success with their toys, they don't really last very long in the industry. They don't have the distribution and wherewithal to really know how to navigate toy retail like Mattel and Coleco do. Now, this is also important because this is Mattel and Coleco's first real taste of this industry, and both of them would launch game consoles within the next couple of years. So we see this introduction into the industry not through the arcade side the way that companies like Atari and Bally, who I'm going to talk about in just a moment, did, but now we see them getting into it through the side of electronic toys. Now, like I said, the New York Times article also discusses the console business, and they feature 3 different systems. Now, the original cartridge-based system that was on the market, the Channel F, doesn't get mentioned at all, which is maybe a sign of the fact that it would be pretty much the last year for the Channel F on the market in any real significant way, because Fairchild just had no more confidence in the business model. And the 3 systems that the New York Times does discuss are the Apollo 2001, the Bally Arcade, and the Atari VCS. Now, the Bally Arcade is sort of well known. If you have any interest in the history of video games, you've probably heard of it. It was a pretty nifty system, but did not get a lot of very good distribution at the time. It would be resurrected later on through licensing deals as the Starcade, but the Atari VCS should be a household name. If you don't know it as the VCS, you may know it as its later renamed version, the 2600. But this Apollo 2001 was a system that even I hadn't heard of, and after doing some research, well, it turns out it was just another Pong clone console. The interesting thing here, though, is that the New York Times article actually gives the prices for all 3 of these. Now, the Atari VCS was the cheapest of them, coming at $190. Now, adjusted for inflation, and I always take those numbers with a grain of salt, but adjusted for inflation, that would be about $730 in 2018 money. So, pricey purchase. The Bally Arcade was $300. Now, that's $1,160 in today's money. And what really blew my socks off was the fact that the Apollo 2001, this glorified Pong machine, was actually retailing for $500. Now, that's an astronomical $1,900 in today's money. So $500 in '78 is insane. Why they thought they could get away with this, whether or not they got away with this, unfortunately, I wasn't really able to discover any further information of it, other than a couple of pictures of it online. But it definitely showed that there were still some people trying to push the Pong technology, even though that boat had sailed. Now, the Bally Arcade pretty much, like I said, died very quickly. The VCS, it was already its second Christmas on the market, and it had only done lukewarm business the first year, and it was a bit of an unknown quantity going into Christmas of '78. And that unknown quantity wasn't something that the higher-ups at Atari's parent company, Warner Brothers, were unaware of. They knew that this could be our make or break. And that leads us to our next story. A profanity-laden shouting match broke out at Warner Brothers' annual budget meeting in New York City between Atari founder Nolan Bushnell and Warner Brothers executive Manny Gerard. Now, to set the scene for you just a little bit, a couple years before this, Nolan Bushnell agrees to sell Atari to Warner Brothers, in large part in order to help finance the launch of the VCS, the 2600. Now, Atari may have been a leader in the video game arcade business, but that still was small potatoes in comparison with the amount of money and investment needed to launch a mass consumer product. Also, they didn't really have the retail connections or anything else. Now, Warner Brothers was one of the largest media companies in the world at the time. They had already purchased several other media companies, and it was just one more purchase into another realm that they saw great potential in. And considering that Atari was the number one video game arcade maker in the world, this seemed like a perfectly natural thing. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why Atari didn't have the money to do all these things was that they were an extremely creative, extremely forward-thinking company, but they didn't really have what you would call professional management. Nolan Bushnell was a rock star forward thinker, but he didn't really know how to manage the day-to-day operations of a company, especially as it got bigger and bigger. Now, Manny Gerard was hoping that giving them the money would make everything a little bit more professional. Unfortunately, that wasn't happening. The first year of the Atari VCS, its launch year of '77, was marred by a whole bunch of returned units, defective units, production problems, no real marketing concept, no proper release scheduling for new games, and so forth. So at this meeting in New York City, the idea of how much money was Atari going to have for the next year, what were they going to be investing that money in, is what leads to this shouting match. Bushnell, according to many sources, he really didn't see a long-term future for the VCS. He thought it was an interesting bit of tech, but that other companies were developing more advanced systems. The Bally Arcade, by some measures, was a more powerful system, and it was already on the market. And he was afraid that the VCS was going to get buried over the next couple of years and that investing further in the system wasn't enough. He wanted more money for more research and development. Now, Manny Gerard saw this as throwing good money after bad because the VCS still hadn't turned a profit. It hadn't been a profitable system, and investing large amounts of money into yet another system that may or may not do any profit business for Warner Brothers, especially considering that the whole idea of a game console with cartridges was yet an unproven product on the market, just wasn't going to fly. And in the background of all of this, Manny Gerard had already basically forced Bushnell to take on Ray Kassar. Now, Ray Kassar was the new manager of day-to-day operations for Atari. He had no background in the tech industry, no background in gaming. He came from the textile industry, and he was slowly but surely rebuilding Atari from the inside. He had cleaned up the manufacturing problems, made sure that the defective rates were not as high. He had a multi-million-dollar ad campaign running. So in many ways, he was laying the foundation of the success of the VCS in future years, while Nolan Bushnell was arguing that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And Manny Gerard is stuck in the middle, not knowing, well, will Cassar's new strategy work? Is Bushnell correct and there is no future to this? But if there's no future to the VCS, why would there be future to any future devices? And basically these two egos clash. Now, what would happen in the Christmas of 78? Well, you'll probably have to come back next month to find out a little bit more about that. But for our purposes at this meeting in November, when these two men clash, it will ultimately have repercussions. It will change the way Atari looks forever. So that ends our trip through November of 1978. Let's turn on the time machine and move forward to November of 1988. November of 1988 is an interesting time for the global video game market. Every major territory, Europe, North America, and Japan, is looking at a completely different set of players. While in the United States, the NES is on its grand tour, taking in over 90% of the market. In Japan, you've got the TurboGrafx, or the PC Engine as it was known over there, really giving the NES a run for its money, as well as a bunch of different homegrown home computer systems dividing up the market amongst themselves. And in Europe, the home computer market, 8 and 16-bit machines from companies like Amstrad, Commodore, and Atari have pretty much divided up the market amongst themselves, with consoles virtually non-starters. So, in order to get a picture of what was going on, let's first jump to the headline that is occupying the time of most of the European magazines all over the continent, and that is the PC show in London. Now, this was a computer fair that had taken on a sort of a role of entertainment fair for computer software, in addition to introducing new PC product. And one of those big PC products that was introduced was Amstrad's PC 100. Now, for those of you not familiar with the name Amstrad, Amstrad was a budget electronics company that had emerged out of the 70s and 80s, first with things like amplifiers, calculators, and so forth. Now, Amstrad originally wasn't producing anything themselves. They were just importing it cheap and labeling it. It was the brainchild of Alan Sugar, basically English business icon and tycoon. He would also later on host the English version of The Apprentice television show. And he had gotten into the PC market with the Amstrad CPC line of 8-bit computers using the Z80 processor, and later on also bought Sinclair Spectrum's developer, Sinclair Research. Now, what this also meant was he was now producing 2 of the 3 major home computers in the 8-bit market in Europe, both the Amstrad and the ZX Spectrum. It made sense. They were both Z80-based processors, and he was really big on selling all-in-one units. So the classic Sinclair Spectrum, the 48K model that you had to buy a separate device for data storage, a separate device to plug in joysticks and so forth, all went away, and he was releasing all-in-one units that had a built-in tape deck, had all the joystick ports and everything built into it. So his model of all-in-one was now looking at how he could break into the 16-bit market. At this point, the 2 big 16-bit home computers were the Commodore Amiga 500 and the Atari ST line of machines. Now, these were, for the most part, just keyboard computers. So you had a keyboard, all the computer components were built into it. You could plug it in usually to a TV or an RGB monitor, and a 3.5-inch floppy drive would also be installed. Hard drives were always additional add-ons, but they were extremely rare actually for the normal consumer. In this marketplace, Amstrad wanted to bring in a rival. They already had some experience with IBM PC clones in your typical baby box models that you'd put a monitor on top of. But now they wanted to make something that might appeal more to the teenage or lower budget audience that was still buying these keyboard computers. And that's where the PC-100 comes in. Now, this was a keyboard computer using a standard PC motherboard, floppy disk drive on the side, hard drive built in, CGA graphics capabilities on board. The only problem was that because it was a standard monitor, and for those of you who have looked inside a PC, you know that all your add-on cards, sound cards, extra graphic cards, and so forth, all stick out at a 90-degree angle to the motherboard. Well, that was also the case with this machine. So it actually had a flap just past the F keys that you could flip up to plug in additional boards. Unfortunately, this also meant that they had to stick out of the machine, were uncovered, and basically just meant that the expandability of this PC-100 was for naught. And all the magazines that were talking about this piece of hardware seemed to come to the same conclusion that, wait, the one advantage of the PC over these other systems is that you can expand it, and this device doesn't have that. And they couldn't figure out who it was supposed to appeal to because CGA graphics with their 4 colors were no competition for an Atari ST or an Amiga 500 with thousands of colors, even though it could usually only display a few dozen on screen at any given time. It just wasn't even in the same market, and the people who did want to do proper business applications, they were going to be buying a normal PC anyway. So it was kind of a miscalculation by Amstrad. It was showing that they really didn't know how to break out of that lower budget market. And there was one extra little bit that's of historical significance, namely that they weren't sure if they were going to be able to deliver it in any large quantities at the price point they wanted because of the RAM shortage that was going on in the world in '88. Now, the RAM shortage of '88 is an interesting story. I can't go into all the details here. I definitely recommend everybody who's even remotely interested in the economics of the computer business and the legal structures of international trade take a look at it. The brief version is that the Japanese had been dumping subsidized chips onto the world market at below cost prices in order to get a foothold in the RAM chip business, had forced a lot of the American producers either out of the business altogether or forced them into going into the larger, far more expensive 512K RAM chips, which were really not that popular at this point because most applications weren't using that much RAM. And so suddenly when the United States government retaliated against this by putting embargoes and extra taxes on the import of these low-cost Japanese chips, it caused sudden freeze in the market. The Japanese couldn't keep producing at those low prices. The Americans had already moved on to higher chips, and so the standard 256K DRAM chips of the time were suddenly something you just couldn't get a hold of. So a low-budget PC, like the PC-100 from Amstrad, which could only really work with 256K RAM chips, suddenly couldn't get any stock, and the 256K RAM chips that were out there were almost as expensive on the market as the 512K ones. Of course, this problem would get solved very quickly because, well, Moore's Law, everybody wanted the bigger and bigger RAM chips, and within a couple of years, this would be gone. But for a brief moment in 1988, it was a huge deal that probably set the IBM PC standard back a year or two in its ability to compete with other low-cost home computer options. Okay, so what else was happening at the PC show in that year? Well, the Amstrad PC-100 was not the only new piece of hardware coming out of England at the show. The other one was coming from a company called Konix. Now, Konix is not really a well-known name outside of Europe, but inside Europe at the time it was one of the major producers of joysticks and other gaming peripherals for home computers. And they were now deciding, okay, we've had enough. We need to get into the actual hardware business. And they were talking about the Konix Slipstream, which would later in the year get renamed to the Konix Multisystem. Now, this was going to be the first UK designed and produced game console. It was supposed to go head-to-head with systems like the NES and the forthcoming Mega Drive / Genesis. It was developed by a team going by the name of Flare. Now, it was made up mostly of former Sinclair Research developers, so these were guys who really knew their stuff about making low price and quite effective hardware. And the big thing that everybody kept talking about, because they'd always print a picture of it, was that one of the peripherals for this new hardware system was going to be a hydraulic chair. So you could basically do flight simulators or flight action games like Afterburner in your own home. Of course, this all seemed a little too good to be true, and even the magazines at the time were very skeptical of it because the price point that they were shooting for was £130 for the hardware. Now, that is about $500 in today's currency. Pretty expensive piece of kit. And the worst part, though, was that the cartridges, and this is where the profit margin for a manufacturer of a console really would come in, were going to have to go on sale for about £50 per game. Now, just to give you an idea, that's twice as much as an NES game was going for in the UK market at the time. So you were going to have this small little company with no internal game development talent of their own, trying to sell you a game that cost twice as much as an NES card. This already spelled disaster. Now, they were promising to have a floppy drive add-on, so you could also buy games on floppy disks, and those would be much, much more reasonably priced, but that was never really going to be an option, especially as an add-on. It had to be included with the original package to even stand a chance. And so the death of the system was pretty much foretold. And by this time the next year, Konix would have completely abandoned the system. Many developers who had started developing games for it were left high and dry. And ultimately, it just faded. The interesting side note is that the Flare team that had developed the hardware kept developing new hardware and ended up selling a prototype called the Flare 2 to Atari a few years later, and Atari would develop that further, and it would become the Atari Jaguar. So, they're just going from one success to the other here. Okay, so enough about hardware. Let's talk about some movers and shakers in the industry that are showing off their stuff at this PC show. And that leads us to a possible Spanish invasion. Two of the biggest Spanish game developers of the 1980s, Dynamic and Topo, both have big news at the PC show. Now, Dynamic is by far the biggest game publisher developer in the Spanish market at this time. And just to give you an idea of what's going on, Spain was not the most developed economy in Europe during the 80s. It was a little bit weaker. It had just come out of the military dictatorship a decade earlier. And so by 1988, when the rest of Europe is starting to move on to the 16-bit platforms, Spain has the highest concentration of 8-bit machines in Europe. The Sinclair Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC, and the Japanese MSX machines, all Z80-based processors, are huge sellers still in Spain. The Commodore 64 is an also-ran in the market. It's there, but it's not as important. And most of the games are still being sold on audio cassettes, which makes reproduction of the games very easy. Now, what the three Z80 machines means is that small publishers, small developers can put a game together at very low costs and also reproduce that game and sell it in large quantities at almost no expense. So Dynamic manages to survive in this market making these games. They've started to branch off into some 16-bit ports. Their Commodore 64 ports have been managed almost exclusively by Imagine in the UK. And so now they're feeling that they need to break out of Spain. They can tell that there's more competition coming, and if they don't have international sales, they're just not going to be able to make it. They've had a few small successes with games like Game Over and Army Moves, but they've always been middling successes, and because they were published by other companies outside of Spain, the profit margins also weren't that high. So at the PC show in London, they decided to make a big show of it. They're going to be publishing their own games. They show off their first titles that they're going to be launching with, and the first one is a game called Game Over 2. Now, Game Over 2 was never released in Spain, or at least not under that name. It was a game that they had released a year earlier called Fantas, and Fantas just got basically relabeled to be Game Over 2 to try to latch on to their sales success. Now, the sales success of Game Over 1, even though it was a fairly decent game but very, very difficult, stemmed largely from a controversy because of a cover by the amazing Luis Royo, a great fantasy artist. And on the cover, you could see half of a woman's nipple. And that half of a woman's nipple caused a stir in England, and everybody went crazy about it, so the game sold a lot better than it probably deserved to. Now, Fantas had an original cover in Spain drawn by the comic book artist Aspiri, another great Spanish artist, a little bit more stylized, no boobage this time, no nipplage, I should say. And instead, we got for the Game Over 2 release in Europe, another wonderful cover by Luis Royo. I definitely recommend you go take a look at it online. It's quite nice. Unfortunately, no nipplage this time. They decided to steer away from the controversy, but at the same time, it got people's attention. The game got only middling reviews. Ratings below 7 out of 10 were the norm. And this was something I don't think that they were used to. Now, the two major gaming magazines in Spain, Micromania and Microhobby. Micromania is actually still running to this day. Never really gave any of the Spanish games anything below a 7. Typically, they would always get 10, 9s, or 8s. Even if the game was middling in quality, probably just a little bit of, boost the local guys type of story, and also because there was a lot of advertising dollars invested in these magazines, not from the English or French developers, but from the Spanish developers. So you always took Spanish game scores with a grain of salt. And unfortunately, the reality check of their games, which were already a few years behind everybody else in their design and technology, it was going to sink them. They'd launch a few more titles like After the War, but nothing would really stick after that. And by the middle of the next decade, Dynamic would cease operations as a regular game publisher. The other big publisher from Spain at the time, Topo, not the other one, there's two others, Topo and Opera. Opera never really gets out of Spain, they never really leave the 8-bit machines, but Topo decides to unite together with a new company on the scene, namely Kix. Now, Kix was a budget label launched by former Mastertronic staff members, them being John Mearman and Leslie Bozen. Now, Mastertronic had started out as a budget label originally in England in the early 80s and had by this point developed into a proper game developer. They were already the distributors for consoles, and they were doing full price titles. So Kix would become a new budget label. They'd start re-releasing games from companies like US Gold and Gremlin, and later on also have deals with LucasArts and several others. But they were also going to mix in new games, low-budget new games, and those included the games from Toposoft, and games like Blackbeard and Stardust would be launch titles for the Kix brand. So Topo got its games outside of Spain, even though it wasn't quite the classy releases that they probably would have hoped for, but at least it kept them going for a few more years. Now, heading over to the United States. Activision has started a new era while Infocom comes to an end. Now, Activision, the world's first third-party publisher, had been going on and off, had moved from consoles during the crash to computer development, and was having a bit of a hard time after a few games didn't quite work out. They really didn't know what to do in the new non-computer age. And so at this point, they had just renamed the company Mediagenic and created Mediagenic as an umbrella corporation. Activision would be a label under it. They also purchased a bunch of other companies, including Infocom, which was famous for the Zork text-adventure games, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the absolutely amazing Bureaucracy. Now, one of the things that Mediagenic was also trying to do at this time was move Activision away from just being games and more into productivity software, word processing, things like that. Needless to say, none of those really worked out. The Mediagenic label would get disbanded or dissolved a few years later. But at this point, they're trying to become a larger media empire. And Infocom, a company that they purchased that had a great legacy of game development, unfortunately was having a hard time adapting to the new realities of the gaming market. Straight up text adventures weren't going to do it anymore. And so in November, in the magazines, especially if we look at Computer Gaming World, November 1988 issue, they're announcing 3 new titles: Journey, Zork Zero, and Shogun. Now, these 3 titles would all still fundamentally be text adventures, but they would all add large graphical flourishes, little mini games, and the like into them to try to make them more appealing to a modern audience. Unfortunately, they would also be the last 3 regular developments by Infocom. After that, Infocom would release a bunch of compilations. There'd be the occasional game using the Infocom license or Infocom name, such as Leather Goddesses of Phobos 2. But unfortunately, the original Infocom dies at the end of these 3 games, and it's like should never be seen again. Continuing with computer gaming news, Marvel sells licenses to its games. Now, they've cut 2 deals that get announced this month. One is with Paragon Software, which was a fairly unknown computer gaming company at the time. And they would go on to release a whole slew of games, including Dr. Doom's Revenge, Amazing Spider-Man, 2 X-Men games, and a Punisher game, all using Marvel licenses. Now, I'm not going to say that these games are good because, well, yeah, that would be an insult to good games. For the most part, these games were absolute garbage, very, very, very poorly programmed. Dr. Doom's Revenge, for example, was a one-on-one fighting game, single player at that, where you were either Captain America or Spider-Man fighting a variety of Marvel villains. Amazing Spider-Man was a puzzle platform single-screen game. The X-Men titles were a little bit of side-scrolling action-adventure puzzle mixes. And their final game with the license, the Punisher game, was the first one that actually started to feel a little bit like a fully realized game concept. Unfortunately, by then, the damage had been done. Now, on the plus side, all of these games had some amazing presentation. They had really cool comic book intros or in-between sequences and some really nice graphical flourishes, but the gameplay itself was not very good. Oh, and the comic book that came with Dr. Doom's Revenge was actually quite good. So, that's one deal. The other deal Marvel signs is with Mastertronic. We just talked about them, the budget label that's trying to go big. And Mastertronic had 2 sub-labels at this point, Melbourne House and Arcadia. Now, Melbourne House was originally an offshoot of a book publisher. The idea was that they were going to be doing video games based on book properties. They had originally done the Hobbit text adventure game. They did the absolutely amazing Samurai Warrior Adventures of Usagi Yojimbo video game for the Commodore 64 and other 8-bit platforms. And there was a newly developed Arcadia label. Now, Arcadia was supposed to develop games for the arcades using modified Amiga 500 arcade boards so that the games could easily and cheaply be ported back to home computers and sold in the home computer market. And the idea here was Mastertronic would make Marvel games through the Arcadia label, put them in the arcades, and then port those and release them on home systems through the Melbourne House label. Now, they had been doing this for a little while already, and they had done a series of games, ARG, that's the name of the game, Magic Johnson's Fast Break, Sidewinder, and Xenon, amongst a few others. None of these games was really setting the world on fire. None of them was all that good. Xenon would be a little bit of a success just because it was a Bitmap Brothers development, and it would get a sequel later on, not in the arcades but at home. But the rest of them were pretty much forgettable also-rans. And unfortunately, the idea of a Mastertronic-produced Marvel arcade game never comes to be. The only game that does come out of this deal, as far as I can tell from my research, is the Silver Surfer game for the NES. Somehow this does get released by Arcadia as an NES game. And, well, it's an infamous game for its extremely high difficulty level, even though its graphics and production values are quite good. So, Marvel still is waiting for its big break into video games. Staying with the arcades, Williams, one of the last big American manufacturers of arcade games at this point, announces a new arcade hardware platform, and that is the MCR68K system. Now, the big selling point of this system is that it's upping the resolution of the games. Now, typically at this point, most arcade games are using a 320 by 224 pixel screen resolution. Now, that's what, for example, the Sega System 16 was using. That's the board that gave us games like Golden Axe and Shinobi. But this new hardware is going to be giving us resolutions of 512 by 480 pixels. I know, for a modern audience, that sounds a little low, but at the time, it was absolutely phenomenal. It was kind of pushing the limits of what you could really display without losing anything on an RGB monitor. So this 512 by 480 pixels was going to promise to give us a bunch of really high-end graphics, and the board did give us some interesting games such as Arch Rivals, which is a very cartoony basketball game, and Xenophobe, which gave us a 3-person split-screen game based around the idea of the Alien movies. So, not the most prolific board in the world, but definitely did something and gave us something new to look at in the arcades. Speaking of Sega, they're finally opening up their home console platforms to third-party publishers. Now, in 1988, in November of 1988, the Sega Mega Drive has already launched in Japan, okay? So, we know that there's going to be another system coming. But in North America and in Europe, the Master System is still their console. And while it has done quite well for itself in Europe, in the United States, it is hovering around less than 10% market share. And so it seems a little weird that they're doing this, but for the very first time, they're going to allow third-party publishers to publish games for the Master System. Now, up until this point, there were games developed by other studios, but they were always published by Sega. You could say it was partially a quality control issue, but I probably would speculate that it was more an issue of trying to control the market and prevent a dumping of games onto the system, similar to what had happened in the crash of '84. Now, the first company to take this on is Activision. Activision already had a long-standing relationship with Sega because they had already published computer ports of many of their games over the years, And they had a nice big back catalog of titles with recognizable licenses and names that they could bring to the Master System. Amongst them, games like Ghostbusters and Rampage. Now, this also would help them set up the mechanics for publishers to bring games to the new Mega Drive in 1989. So, in a way, it's Sega realizing that they need a new business model, and they can do it at a very low cost and experiment with what works and what doesn't work on the Master System before they do the international launch of the Mega Drive. That concludes the news for November of 1988. So let's turn on the time machine one last time and move forward to November of 1998. Let's start out with Nintendo, the big N. Now, in the handheld market, they are really killing it at this point in time. They have just released the first generation of Pokemon games in North America the month before in September. 2 months before in September. This is, of course, 2 years after they released it in Japan, so it has already been a massive success there. There's a lot of hype going on that this thing is coming, this absolute game changer, and when it lands in the United States, it doesn't just land with the game. All the merchandise, television show, everything is basically ready and primed to go. Europe won't get the game for a whole year yet, but it hits in the United States in a big bad way. At the same time, in Japan, the first Pokemon movie hits theaters, and that movie becomes the 6th highest grossing film in Japanese history at the time. So Nintendo really doesn't seem to be able to do anything wrong with those first generation Pokemon games. At the same time, also in the handheld news, the Game Boy Color, the follow-up to the Game Boy, which is going to solve all the blurring issues and finally add some color to the screen, go where the Lynx had gone 9 years earlier. That hits the market in October of 98 in Japan, and in November of 98 it is being released simultaneously in North America and in Europe. Now, the first two Pokemon games were not color games. They did not have the extra color features, so it's kind of weird that they're launching their biggest original Game Boy game at the same time that they're launching the Game Boy Color. But at the same time, the Game Boy Color is not being really pushed that much as a brand new system, as the resolution is the same, and some of the biggest titles announced for it are remakes of old black and white Game Boy games like Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening and Wario Land. Now, that kind of ends the good news for Nintendo at this point, because over in Japan in November of 98, they're supposed to be holding their Space World convention. This was the Nintendo-only convention to show off their newest and coolest products, and unfortunately the two frontrunners that were supposed to be shown at this show were not ready. The first one was the 64DD. This was a disk drive, a magnetic disk drive for the 64 that was supposed to add things like rewritability, expanded memory, some online capabilities, and so forth. Unfortunately, it was not ready for show and would get delayed again and again. Finally, it would see limited release in Japan and never get outside of that territory. So players in Europe and North America never got their hands on this device, and relatively few software titles were actually developed for it because of that. So the Nintendo 64, which was already struggling on the market at this point, doesn't really get a lot of help by having this add-on delayed. The other big thing that Nintendo was promising to show at the show was the follow-up to that first generation of Pokemon titles, namely Gold and Silver. And they also were not yet ready to be shown. Now, whether or not this was just the product wasn't ready yet, maybe they wanted to delay it, seeing as the North American launch had just happened, but the games weren't ready to show either. So Nintendo decides to postpone Space World first by 3 or 4 months, then a little bit more, and then finally they just decide, hell with it, we'll do it again next November, and November of 99 would be the next Space World. The only thing that Nintendo does launch at this time is, oh, they don't actually launch it, they announce it, is the N64 RAM expansion. Now, this was a little extra cartridge that you could plug into your N64 in order to give it a little bit more memory. This made certain things like draw distances, especially in games like Rogue Squadron, a little bit more tolerable, so that fog that was constantly there was a little bit further off. It was a band-aid on a real problem for the system on games that were using a lot of textures or had a lot of polygons going on screen. So that takes care of Nintendo's home products. Now, there is some news for Nintendo in the arcade. Now, Nintendo hadn't really been much of a player in the arcade space for quite a while. So it came as a bit of a surprise when they decided to launch a new arcade hardware board. And they did it, unfortunately, at the same time that Sega was. So Nintendo's offering is called the Alex 64. Now, this was basically just a slightly souped-up N64 board to be used in the arcades, and that would also allow for easy porting of games over to the N64. Now, the board itself, the arcade machines never got out of Japan. They were used primarily for some puzzle games, even some adult-themed casual titles for bars, and basically just sputtered out. Remember, the N64 at this point is already a couple years old, and it already wasn't the most powerful system to begin with. Sega, on the other hand, is launching the Naomi board. Now, this was an arcade version of the Dreamcast hardware. And the Dreamcast, at this point, is just launching in Japan. It won't be out in North America for another year. But it's badass. At this point, it is a really strong piece of hardware. It can do wonderful 3D, wonderful 2D, and the Naomi board ends up giving us some amazing titles like Dead or Alive 2, House of the Dead 2, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, one of my personal favorites, and of course Power Stone, which was a really great arena fighting game for up to 4 players. Now, the Naomi would allow all the publishers to be able to port their arcade games very easily to the home, and it did give the Dreamcast some of its best titles. Unfortunately, the arcade was starting to dwindle in its importance. This was the golden age of the RPG on the PlayStation. Complex games like Metal Gear just meant that the arcade experience, with its quick in and out gameplay mechanics, was starting to be less and less interesting to a lot of players, and well, we know what the arcades look like today, unfortunately. And since we're talking about Sega and the Dreamcast, let's talk about their launch of the system in Japan. So in Japan, the 128-bit console launches. It has a really good, strong launch, and unlike launches in the past, like the Mega Drive back in '88, the Sega Dreamcast is getting a lot of coverage immediately from the Western press. It's more common now that magazines will be sending out correspondents to Japan to play with the system, to take a look at it, even though they know it won't be launched in the US for another year. And of course, the big launch window games, things like Soul Calibur and Crazy Taxi, look freaking spectacular, but almost universally throughout the magazines, the comments keep coming that the rest of the games look kind of weird. And unfortunately, that weirdness was going to be something that was going to plague the Dreamcast for years to come. It gave it cult status after the fact, but at the time, a lot of people didn't know what to do with Seaman and other games like that. And the fact that there's very few third-party publishers really jumping on board with titles is also something that the observers at the time were noticing. They were noticing that you did not have the big Square Enix games, you did not have the big EA games, and so forth. And this was, of course, a legacy from Sega's mismanagement of third-party information and too many platforms and so forth from their 32-bit days with the 32X and the Sega Saturn. So, unfortunately, already right from the Japanese launch, a year before the Western launch, Dreamcast is already looking like it's on shaky ground. Now, in other news, we're getting a report from Next Generation Magazine that the first major current console emulator has hit. Now, Psych was the first functioning PlayStation 1 emulator to hit the PC. And this was a big bombshell at the time. Nobody knew who the authors were. They would later be identified as Giovanni Bajo and Stefano Crosara. And while this could not play most games, it could play a handful of commercial titles. And it couldn't just play them one-to-one the way they were on the systems, like previous console emulators like Super NES emulators or Mega Drive emulators had done. Instead, it could actually use the hardware acceleration in PCs to up the resolution. Remember, these are games that are now running not off of sprites, but off of vectors for the most part. So rendering those vector models and those vector graphics in a higher resolution suddenly became very, very possible with 3D acceleration in PCs. This kind of move really got a lot of people speculating. I personally remember downloading Psych when it came out and trying it out with some of my friends' PlayStation games. I didn't own a PlayStation myself. Was absolutely fascinated by a handful of titles. I had a disturbing love for Battle Arena Toshinden, even played the PC port quite a bit on that. And of course, Soul Calibur, Metal Gear Solid, and so forth. Games that either would never get PC ports or would get very lame and somewhat buggy PC ports years later. So this seemed like a great way to play a lot of these games. Of course, at this point, virtually none of them actually worked on the PC through Psych, but it was an insight into what was coming. And interestingly enough, already at this early stage, one of the speculations in the article in Next Generation Magazine is that potentially, because of the similar architecture of the Dreamcast to a high-end PC at the time, it might be possible to port an emulator like Psych to the Dreamcast, allowing it to play PlayStation games. And this would actually happen a couple years later with Bleemcast, which was a PlayStation emulator for the Dreamcast. Not a lot of games got emulated this way, but it was something that these guys were already seeing the potential of. Quite entertaining. And of course, nowadays we all know emulation is everywhere, but the idea of current system emulation is, for the most part, still not possible. This was just this weird little moment where 3D accelerators had overtaken what the consoles could do, and 2 years before the PlayStation 2 would arrive on the scene. Okay, now, in other PC gaming news, online gaming gets hit with its first real lawsuit. Okay, so just to set the stage here, in November of 1998, online games are usually still played through modems, 56K, and so forth. And so the idea of big, massive game worlds wasn't really a thing yet, but we had the first major game. Now, it wasn't by far the first MMO, but it was the first big one, super well financed by a PC gaming juggernaut, namely EA, and that was Ultima Online. Now, Ultima Online is still running today, and it was being sued back then in a class action lawsuit claiming that it had not fulfilled its promises of allowing people to play 24/7 continuously or almost continuously. They were claiming that the many server downtimes, patch downloads, crashes, desyncing, and so on and so forth was grounds for compensation to players who had invested in the game. And they were trying to prove this point in part, and this came after I looked up some of the old court documents. They were trying to base it off of the idea that Ultima Online was first a beta that you had to pay to get onto, and that they knew from the beta already that the servers were unstable, people were constantly getting kicked off, and therefore they shouldn't have been making these promises for the final product. Well, thankfully for the entire industry, this lawsuit had no legs. The idea that a technical problem might arise without becoming or making the product unplayable was not enough grounds for any kind of lawsuit. Ultimately, the case was quote-unquote settled out of court. EA made a small contribution, financial one, to a computer history museum, and the attorney who brought the lawsuit got zero, which is kind of a nice thing under these circumstances. And so, yeah, the first big class action lawsuit against an MMO. Great moments in history. Our last story from November of 1998 also involves online gaming. A new study has revealed that 89% of people who play games online are not willing to pay to play. Now, today, if I told you that number, you'd be like, really? It's only 89%? But back in November of 1998, at a time when online purchases of games were virtually unthinkable, and you normally just went down to a store, paid your 30, 40, 50, even $60 for a game, and didn't even think twice about that business model, the idea that online gamers, the people who were already going online to play games, were unwilling to pay for those games was quite an insight. And so this study is looking at this and figuring out that the people simply assume that if you're doing it online, you don't have to pay for it, that that's what ads are for or whatever else. And another interesting side note in this study and coming out of this, and this is according to the CEO of Virtual Vegas, a free online casino site as it's described, stated that 42% of their players were female. Now, in the general populace, this was not the case. Women were not that active in the gaming scene. So 42% of the online players were female was a huge, huge deal. May have had something to do with the fact that this was a online casino, not, a first-person shooter game. But it is interesting to see that 42% were female, and he attributes it to the community interaction aspect of the website. So the ability to talk with other people and so forth. So practically merging gaming with a chat bot or chat system really did make the difference and was the long-term appeal for female gamers. Something to be learned even today, probably. So, okay, with that being said, we're going to end our time travels at this point. I hope that you've had fun listening to me rant and rave and talk about all this stuff, and I hope that it is a format that opens up little doors that might lead to you wanting to learn more about the history of video gaming and other things that are going on in the industry. Of course, I'd love to hear some feedback on the episode, know what you think about it. You can leave a comment here. You can find me on Facebook and on Twitter. On Twitter, I'm Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. And on Facebook, you can also find it under Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. There shouldn't be too many other people using that moniker. Or you can send me an email at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. So, with that being said, I'll look forward to seeing all of you next month. And until next time, have fun.